Welcome to CLSI's expert panel session, What's New in CLSI Standards Development? I'd like to now turn it over to our host, Jennifer Adams, Vice President of Standards and Quality.
Hello, and welcome to this expert panel information session. Thank you for taking the time to join us today. Next slide, please. My name is Jennifer Adams. Today, Glenn Fine and I will be talking about what's new in CLSI standards development. This will include discussion of the limited revision process and the expanded scope of CLSI documents. Next slide. Just a few notes about Q&A before we get started. You're encouraged to submit questions at any time during this session using the Q&A feature located at the bottom of your screen. Questions will be addressed when the presentations conclude. If we don't have enough time to get to your question during the live session, you will receive a response by email. Next slide. Okay, so off we go. Let's start with the limited revision process. Next slide. You may be wondering why a limited revision process? Well, a couple of years ago, several expert panels brought forth the concept for Consensus Council's consideration. Since that time, Council's been working on engineering a process. The process was slated for introduction at the March 2020 Committees Week. Unfortunately, the pandemic hit and Committees Week was canceled, so we're bringing it to you now. The purpose of the limited revision process is to provide an expeditious alternative to the consensus document development process for standards and guidelines when document updates meet defined criteria. The process is used to alter and/or add to previously agreed upon technical provisions in an existing CLSI consensus document. Next slide. Limited revisions are not meant to result in changes to a document's scope, purpose, or intended audience. They are not intended to significantly affect recommendations related to the methodology used or application of the consensus document. In the limited revision process, only the altered or added content is open for comments and voted on by the responsible parties. This process is not used for revisions that include substantive issues, nor does it apply to document corrections. Next slide. Examples of revised content may include functional changes, modifications to align with another CLSI or ISO document or current best practice, a refinement or clarification of existing information, or definition changes. So what does this mean? Let's take a look at an example and get your feedback. Next slide. Here's a scenario for you. A published CLSI document contains several equations to characterize the performance of a test system widely used throughout the world. Recently, it was discovered that one of the equations was incorrect. Specifically, a minus sign was incorrectly placed in front of an absolute value variable. Subject matter experts agree that the minus sign is incorrect. So the question is, should the removal of the minus sign be considered as a limited revision? Yes, no, or it depends. Please submit your answer to the poll. Okay, the answer is no. In this case, the removal of a minus sign would be handled as a document correction. Remember, a limited revision's focus is more broad, like changes to a particular procedure or clarification of a statistical approach. Next slide. When the need for a limited revision is identified by a document user, such as a CLSI delegate, a volunteer, or expert panel member, the limited revision process can be used. Once the recommended revisions are identified and marked in the document, they are reviewed by the expert panel and the limited revision proposal form is completed. The proposed revisions, which are included as track changes in the document and completed form, are submitted to CLSI. CLSI staff then route the marked up document and completed proposal form to the appropriate expert panel for review and endorsement. If it is determined that special reviewers are needed, they are selected by the expert panel for their particular expertise and invited to review and comment on the proposed revisions during this step of the process. Next slide. On the limited revision proposal form, we ask submitters to provide a rationale for the revisions, to identify whether the revisions would result in changes to the document's scope, purpose, or intended audience, to provide a description of how the revisions might affect CLSI's constituents, to list other important factors that should be considered as the proposal is evaluated, and to identify any CLSI documents or products that reference the document to be revised. Next slide. During this step, the expert panels vote to endorse the recommended revisions. The committee's endorsement confirms that the recommendation for revision meets the requirements for a limited revision. The proposed revisions are needed, and the revisions are accurate, practical, comprehensible, and useful. Conditions to endorse the recommended revisions are: one member from each of the three constituencies must vote affirmatively, and a two-thirds majority of the expert panel's votes must be affirmative. When the revision is endorsed, the recommendation for limited revision is submitted to the Consensus Council to be authorized for delegate vote and public review. Once the project is authorized by Consensus Council, document revisions are submitted for editorial review. Next slide. During the editorial process, only the revised content is reviewed and edited. The revisions are retained as red-line text for the review period. Under the limited revision process, previously approved content is not updated to meet current editorial style or document formats. Next slide. After the revised portions of the document are edited, it is circulated to the CLSI delegates for a 30-day vote and made available for public comment during the same period. The delegate voting announcement and public review information provide the rationale for the changes and indicate that only the revised marked text is to be reviewed and commented on, and that comments pertaining to other portions of the document will be held for the next full revision. After conclusion of the delegate vote, any comments received on the revised content are resolved by the expert panel. Comment resolutions are distributed to the commenters with a notice of right to appeal for a 20-day period. When the comment resolution activities are completed, the approved document is submitted to the Consensus Council for confirmation of process adherence and a vote for publication. When approved, the document proceeds to the publication process and is published with the next edition number. Next slide. To summarize, here are the process takeaways. Expert panels endorse recommended revisions. Consensus Council approves distribution for proposed draft vote and public review, confirms process adherence, and approves documents for publication. The proposed draft voting period is 30 days in duration. The proposed draft is voted on by the responsible expert panel and CLSI membership. It is provided to the Consensus Council and Board of Directors for comment and made available to the public upon request for comment. Revised content is marked in the voting draft. Only the revised content is open for comment and vote. Comments received on unrevised text will be held for the next full revision of the document. The notice of right to appeal is 20 days in duration. Next slide. The Consensus Council determined that piloting the limited revision process would allow us to test the process's effectiveness before broadly adopting it. To that end, several projects have entered into this process. They include C62 on liquid chromatography mass spec, QMSO2 on laboratory documents development and control, H47 PT and APTT tests, EP14 evaluation of commutability, and MBSO3 newborn screening for preterm, low birth weight, and sick newborns. We're excited to give this process for limited revision of documents a try, and we'll keep the expert panels updated on progress as we move through it. We appreciate the expert panels suggesting the implementation of this process. Please note, we're listening. If you have suggestions for process changes, don't hesitate to let us know. Next slide. With that, I would like to turn the presentation over to Glenn Fine. Glenn will be talking to you about the expanded scope of CLSI documents. Glenn?
Great, thanks, Jen. Everybody can hear me, right, Jen? Yes, you can hear me, right?
Yes.
Okay, good. All right. Well, by way of introduction, start off with every organization or sport team always has some form of unwritten rules by which they operate. And one of our longest standing ones is that CLSI, at CLSI, is that if it's never really been formally codified in some flavor, is the statement something to the effect that, next slide, please, CLSI does not create standards or guidelines that directly engage in the practice of medicine. Or, as you see quoted on this slide, CLSI does not provide guidance on or related to the practice of medicine. So for as long as I've been at CLSI, and I've been as guilty as anyone of preaching this, is that we definitely do not get directly involved. However, there was a recent solid project proposal put forth to the Consensus Council by the expert panel on molecular diagnostics, which brought this issue to a head and highlighted the need for clarification and was discussed by the board of directors for some discussion and guidance on exactly what does this mean, because clearly there are bright lines related to clinical practice guidelines or evidence-based medicine studies, and as such, that's not what CLSI does. What we will do and continue to always will do is remain true to our consensus-based standards and guidelines. However, it could be readily argued that any of our standards or guidelines, if fully implemented, result in better healthcare, human or animals, by the way. What, by definition, better healthcare in almost all facets has a physician or clinician component to it. Adding to this, with introduction of new technologies, focus on personalized medicine, etc., the practice of lab medicine continues to evolve, and we want to be sure at CLSI to evolve with it. So in addition to professional, scientific, consultative, administrative, and educational matters relevant to the services offered, laboratory directors are expected to provide clinical advice with respect to testing, methodologies, appropriate use of lab information in different clinical situations, as well as the interpretation of examination results, lab results. In short, use of CLSI's portfolio is at least one aid in any medical decision criteria. And finally, there is already plenty of precedent for inclusion of consultative service and/or clinical interpretation strategies and information in existing CLSI standards and guidelines. For example, next slide. M100. M100 is one of CLSI's most widely distributed documents and includes performance standards criteria for antimicrobial susceptibility testing. The tables presented in this document represent the most current information for drug selection, interpretation, and quality control. In addition, these tables provide contraindications for the reporting of certain drug-bug site combinations for which laboratories may be penalized for violations in their proficiency testing. M100 is managed by the Subcommittee on Antimicrobial Susceptibility Testing, whose purpose is to provide useful information to enable laboratories to assist the clinician in the selection and appropriate antimicrobial therapy for patient care. Another one, and again, there are many examples which clearly the statement that we do not directly engage in the practice of medicine could be interpreted as being an absolute statement, whereas there are gradients along the bell-shaped curve, so to speak, of what we do. Another one is Veterinary 09, which discusses susceptibility test data as a component of the antimicrobial stewardship process. And the report provides veterinarians with the information needed to successfully acquire and interpret antimicrobial susceptibility tests. These examples include test selection, which antimicrobials to test the analytic phase, and interpretation of test results in the post or post-post analytical phases on interpretation. So there are many other examples which can be included here in our portfolio of standards and guidelines, but just to use two. The blanket statement is truly an overstatement that we do not get involved in the practice of medicine. So the question becomes in slide 3. Next slide, please. Looking, as the board discussed expanding the scope of CLSI standards, we looked at the factors both in the laboratory field as well as the realities that establishing diagnostic stewardships is an essential element of collaborative consultation, improving communications among medical care providers, and implementation of laboratory test findings to support the effective healthcare. And again, you can read the last couple of bullets on this slide, but it gets very gray very quickly. And what I would say is the issue why this is being raised at this point and attempted to be clarified is that while this talk doesn't necessarily represent a major change of direction for the content and expanded breadth of CLSI standards and guidelines, it is an attempt to clarify, number one, that consideration of development for new project proposal ideas, and within those ideas, the potential scope of the project need to be clarified. So such as the molecular diagnostics proposal that came forward, both the proposer as well as the consensus council, which ultimately decides which projects move forward, was working within the past paradigm that many of the elements of that proposal kind of moved into the consultation, education, advice role. And was that in scope or out of scope for CLSI documents? So the precipitating event led to both a clarification for proposers of new projects, as well as those bodies, volunteer leadership bodies, which are entrusted with evaluating those proposals for actual acceptance and moving forward. And that includes both our 10 expert panels, as well as the consensus council. So the idea here is not to create a big, long policy and procedure around this, but to merely educate as we move along the reality that we should not be restrictive in terms of this past unwritten practice that we do not get involved in the practice of medicine. Because ultimately the practice of medicine doctrine is that the clinician uses the best advice from all standards for he or she has related to peer-reviewed journals, practice guidelines, CLSI standards, and everything before making any healthcare or practice decisions. So with that, we are way ahead of schedule, which I'm sure nobody will complain about, but perhaps back to you, Megan, to take questions at this point, or we can just have questions.
Yes, at this time, we wanted to remind everyone to please submit their questions using the Q&A feature on your screen. This is a question from, or for Jen. If you are already working on a revision request, can you change it to a limited revision process?
That's a really good question. Right now, we are just conducting a pilot. So any document that is being reviewed for the possibility of revision, unless it's one of those pilot projects that were listed, we would still put them through our regular revision process.
Thank you. And this one is also related to limited revision. What are the target dates to complete the limited revision process pilot programs?
So if we're talking about the pilot program in and of itself, we're looking at about an 18-month timeline. Where we pick up, I'll say pick up time, is in the preparation of the revisions. So the expert panels will receive, as I mentioned, a marked up document that shows the recommended revisions. And that is a time saver in and of itself. Once those revisions are submitted, then the expert panel can go through them and determine the practicability of them, and then we move forward with the process. We also pick up a little bit of time when the document's out for proposed draft vote. As was mentioned, it's out for 30 days as opposed to 60 days. We believe that providing a document with marked changes will help focus those individuals that are reviewing it. And we also pick up 10 days in the appeal process.
Thank you. And the next question we have is, when do you think the limited revision process might be approved for everyone to use?
That's a good question. So right now, 3 of the 5 pilot projects are very close to being submitted for expert panel endorsement. So as I mentioned, we're talking probably, at the outside 18 months. So I would say somewhere in the 18-month range. If all goes well, hopefully we will be able to adopt this process more broadly.
Thank you. At this time, we do not have any more questions. So we're going to conclude today's program. Once more, if you have questions, you can always submit them to customerservice@clsi.org. Thank you.